So when we come to the OTO, or we come into the Thelemic community and become Thelemites or recognize ourselves as Thelemites, depending on how you want to put it, there's a crisis that goes on between Thelemic values and the values that we used to have or that we're getting rid of. And you see this in every single major religious movement in the course of human civilization. You look at Christians becoming Christians when they were once pagans or Jews in the Roman period. You look at barbarians who are becoming Christians in the later Roman period. You look at Chinese Buddhists becoming Buddhists when formerly they were involved in other indigenous Chinese religious systems. So all of this praxis and all of this sort of experience involves a crisis where you have to put away your old ideas and beliefs and accept these new ones. And one of the telling things in the Thelemic community is it doesn't seem that people really recognize that crisis very readily. There aren't a lot of stories going around in the community about how people had this sort of road to Damascus moment or how they struggled with Thelema. It just seems to be something that isn't really the same kind of crisis or big deal that it is for people historically in these other faiths. And I think it's really important to look at this in terms of what Crowley himself went through. I mean, you and I privately talk about this a great deal, that if you study Crowley's own response to the Book of the Law, it was very fraught, it was very tortured, he tried to reject it, he couldn't accept it, he struggled with it for many, many years. And he writes about this fairly honestly and keeps saying that he did little tricks to try to change the words in the Thelemic canon that bothered him, that he tried to interpret things symbolically when, rather than looking at their more obvious meanings because he didn't want to face the real implications of them. We don't really see people in the Thelemic communities having this kind of struggle. And what I've noticed is that when people join the OTO, for example, they sort of see their initiation not as a crisis or as a sort of new transformation, but instead as a sort of empowerment. Whatever you were before you were in the OTO, now you're a powered version of that. If you were a Wiccan, you go through OTO initiations, and now you're a power Wiccan. If you're a liberal secular humanist and you go through your OTO initiations, you're an empowered, tougher, stronger liberal secular humanist. If you're a neoconservative Republican, then suddenly you're a power neoconservative Republican. And the idea that Thelema is going to seriously alter or change your previously held beliefs is not something that we see a lot of people coming to terms with. Now, in talking to a friend recently who was out here visiting me from the East Coast, he said very bluntly that the less we see people talking about this conversion crisis, the more we basically can say to ourselves, well, they haven't really engaged in the material to any significant extent, because if they had, they would be having the same sort of crisis Crowley had about it. And you think to yourself, look at Aleister Crowley. If he approached the OTO and Thelema the same way most of the people that we know are, instead of becoming a Thelemite, he would just have become a power Buddhist, right? Because Buddhism was the religion that he was ascribing to when he received the Book of the Law. So this whole dynamic needs really a lot of study and a lot of examination. Why are people unwilling to really look at the crisis that Thelema offers them?
Well, I think this also kind of goes into the combination, the Thelemic this, the Thelemic Buddhist.
Right. I'm a Thelemic Wiccan. I'm a Thelemic Buddhist. I can do a half-assed version of Thelema and a half-assed version of Buddhism and put them together and somehow have a whole ass. You're not going to. In fact, it'll probably be more half-assed than either of the two half-assed things you were doing before that.
Why do you think this is happening? Are people just not really into Thelema?
I don't think many people really are. I think they're afraid of it. It's too difficult for them. The implications of it are too disturbing and too profound. And again, I mean, we're in a sort of interesting period, in terms of our culture, where people think they're free already. They're not, but they think that they are. They're free to make their own choices. They're free to buy Coke or Pepsi. They're free to take whatever low-paying job their education will give them. They're free to marry, whoever they want. And this sort of freedom that they have, they think is Thelemic. So why would there be a major cultural or personal crisis around accepting Thelema when we're sort of in what they think is a Thelemic community already? This is one of the reasons why our leaders, for example, don't really have the same kind of critique of modernity and a critique of their times that Crowley used to. Crowley used to rage constantly about the civilization and the culture around him. He thought it had a lot of problems. Our current leaders, they're happy middle-class people. They think the secular humanist world is fine for them. They don't have any critique of it. If anything, they have a critique for Crowley and his, perceived misogyny or racism issues or sexism or, all of the little PC concerns they have are much more important in terms of Crowley than Crowley's critique of modernity. So consequently, how can you go through a profound conversion experience if what you're already experiencing is more or less Thelemic?
Or you think it's Thelemic.
Right, you think it's Thelemic. And see, part of the problem here is that people don't recognize the totalizing aspect of the culture that they're already living in. And, we point this out a lot, that just because you don't see your society as being a totalitarian in the same way the former Soviet Union was or, Cambodia under Pol Pot was, doesn't mean that it's not a totalitarian society.
Well, what I find fascinating is when I talk to people about metaphysics and underlying ideologies, people actually look me straight in the face and go, but I don't have an ideology. And I look at them and it's impossible not to have an ideology. Maybe you didn't choose one. Maybe you didn't consciously create one, but you have one. It was probably given to you by the society around you, your parents and your environment.
Right.
And it's so common sense, you don't even know that you have it.
Do you have values? Do you know what things are right and what things are wrong? Do things morally offend you? Do you get upset about things? All of these things indicate what your ideology is. And Gramsci, the Marxist thinker, points out that ideology is praxis. It's what you live your life doing. So if you live your life in a middle-class world, in a middle-class family, in a middle-class job, buying middle-class things and watching middle-class TV, your ideology is middle-class because you couldn't participate in all of those things without a set of middle-class values. And it's the same thing with lumpen values. It's the same thing with proletariat or working-class values. It's the same thing with underclass values. It's the same thing with upper-class values. You can't spend your life working in the ballet and say, I don't have a cultural ideology. Of course you do. It's around you all the time. You may not notice it. It may be so ingrained that you forget it, but you're like a fish that doesn't know what water is because you're surrounded by it all the time. Gnosticism and magic is about finding out what that water is. I mean, a magician or a Gnostic is really a fish that knows it's wet. So when people say that they don't really know, that they don't think they have an ideology or that the ideology they live in isn't totalizing or that Thelema hasn't created any problems for them, usually it's because they're fish who don't know that they're wet yet. And it's one thing when you have like first or second degrees in the OTO or new people that have some stupid ideas about this, because we all do when we're new. I mean, we're struggling with it, we're trying to get it. When someone's been in the group for 20 years and they still don't think that they have an ideology or they still think that you can be a Thelemite and a Buddhist at the same time and that's not going to create a problem for you, then that's just insane. And unfortunately, that's the situation that we have in the OTO right now. Most of our leaders, sadly enough, don't grasp these things. They haven't studied it, they haven't really looked at it, and they've made peace with Thelema in a way that fends off the inevitability of the sort of crisis that Crowley went through when he had to accept it. The other thing a lot of people think, and I see this all the time in talking to people, is that they're hoping their HGA experience is going to wipe out all the things in the Book of the Law that they don't like. When their HGA comes along, he's going to show them what things really are, and all the stuff they have a problem with Crowley about is going to go away. Well, that didn't happen with Crowley. When he had his HGA experience, he got a raft of stuff he didn't want to hear. Why do they think it's going to be any different for them? If they don't like Crowley, they don't like what Aiwass had to say to him, how do they know that what their HGA is going to say to them isn't going to be 1,000,000 times worse?
Well, probably what will happen is they won't actually go to have an HGA experience. They'll just pretend their imaginary friend from childhood is their HGA and live a secular humanist life.
Yeah, and they will never really be conscious of their ideology or anything else. And we see this all the time when people don't really know where their values come from. And even smart people just, they think it's just common sense. And magic and Gnosticism on its real level is understanding who you are. And that means understanding what common sense is. And the beliefs that you know about, that you're aware of, the ideologies that you can get a handle on, are usually not the ones that are powerful. The really powerful ones are the ones you don't see. And this is why one of the things that we like to do is talk about class issues a lot, because class in America is like dark matter. No one sees it, but its gravitation determines everything around it.
Right, and it's another thing that people deny exists.
Right, and they don't want to look at, they don't want to, one of my friends was pointing out that middle-class people, Purcell points this out in his book, middle-class people don't want to talk about class because it makes them nervous. And the OTO members who are middle class don't want to talk about the fact that the middle class really runs the OTO right now, or the leadership cadre is predominantly middle class, or that middle class members of the OTO seek to impose a middle class, humanist or egalitarian democratic ideal on the rest of the OTO, whether they realize it or not, because that's what common sense is. That's what the good is to them. It's not examined. They don't think about it. They certainly don't consider Crowley's critiques of it. What did he know? He was a misogynist. He was a terrible person. Look at all the bad things he said. That means we don't have to listen to him. We can do what we know is right. And what we know is right is really being determined by the practice and superstructures of the world that we live in. Not the world we create consciously, but the world we sustain as we just go about our lives, buying our stuff, working our jobs, having our relationships, doing our crap. And this is what, you and I, if we can ever achieve anything at all, will be to get some people in the OTO to start looking at this stuff and realizing just how determined their reality really is, so that they have a chance at changing it. Because you can't change things you're unaware of. And if the OTO is struggling with a lot of this stuff, if the larger Thelemic community is struggling with a lot of this stuff, and I think the larger occult community, the pagan community, whatever you want to put it, I think they're all fighting with this stuff. If you don't know what you're fighting against, you can't get anywhere. And the saddest thing I think both of us have observed are people struggling with this stuff and not even knowing what they're fighting with.
Right, and to actually know what they're fighting with, people are going to have to do the work, they're going to have to do the reading, they're going to have to make a lot of effort to do this.
Right,
and not easy.
Part of that effort is accepting things that are difficult to accept. I mean, one of the questions that we get a lot is that people find that the books are hard to understand. Well, there's complex things that are hard to understand, and there's easy things that are difficult to accept. The Book of the Law has got complex aspects, and the Thelemic Holy Books have complex aspects, but the hardest things in them are often not the most complex things or the most difficult to understand things. They're the hardest to accept things. And things are hard to accept for us because they go against our ideas of goodness and fairness and equality and justice, and all the ideals that we're born into in a world that is created and sustained by people using those ideals to go about their lives and do their business. So initiation is really getting free of those ideals, which is going to look diabolic and mean and crazy to people sometimes, just the way you and I look mean and perhaps crazy to people sometimes.
Right, and strict and cruel and uncaring.
Yeah. Right, and uncaring and unfeeling, because we have to be all of those things sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, in order to break through the bonds that are created around us by a society which is imposing its viewpoint on us in a very, very uncompromising way. Yeah, we want people to look at this, and we want people to have a conversion crisis. I mean, I would love to see people really being honest about the stuff that they're having trouble with, or the stuff they had trouble with and overcame, rather than this is my rationalization that I use to make sure that Thelema really means equality for everybody, or that Thelema really means that I have to be concerned about what happens to poor people.
And people should understand that you and I are still dealing with this problem.
Of course. Why would we be talking about this or even working on this if we weren't still dealing with it?
Right. I mean, there are times, that I struggle with trying to live a Thelemic life, because I still have so many of the normative values deeply ingrained in me. And when I do things that I interpret that are Thelemic, that go against the norm, I feel an internal struggle about it.
Oh, yeah.
It's not easy for me.
Right, it's not easy at all. And ideally, our community is there to help reinforce Thelemic values for us, not to reinforce societal values. And this is the great crisis of the Thelemic community, is that it doesn't have enough people in it yet who are really Thelemites to reinforce Thelemic values. So it winds up sort of being divided against itself. I was reading a novel yesterday that quoted Kierkegaard as saying, "Despair begins with the division of the will." And when your will is divided between trying to serve two masters, the normative world of Judeo-Christian influenced secular humanism and bourgeois normative values, which determine the world most of us live in, or the values of Thelema and Aleister Crowley, who was totally opposed to that world and those values, you're in despair, because the will has been split. And that's one of the reasons why I think the OTO is in many ways such an unhappy community, and why it's in denial and